morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 17. We're talking about fungi and lichens. At the end of the previous video, we just started talking about lichens and how they work. That a lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. The way the relationship works is that the fungus will use its hyphae to dissolve whatever they're growing on, tree bark, a rock, a brick, the ground. Dissolve whatever they're growing on to get vitamins and minerals from it and to absorb water from the ground or from their substrate. The fungus will then deliver that water and those nutrients to the algae. The algae will make food for both of them, for the algae and for the fungus. The algae benefits by having a place to live because otherwise it'd have to live in water, and the fungus benefits by being fed by the algae. It doesn't have to look for food. It doesn't have to make, or it doesn't have to find its own food. If you were to separate the algae from the fungus could survive, the algae could survive without the fungus, but the fungus would die. The fungus cannot live by itself anymore. It is no longer capable of breaking down its own food. It has to be fed by the algae. We just got done talking about a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a protist, an algae. Now let's talk about the symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a plant. And this is called Mycorrhizae. Myc, M-Y-C, means fungus. Rhize refers to roots. So the name Mycorrhizae means fungus root. When you think about a fungus growing in the ground, you might actually think of something that's trying to hurt the plant. And sometimes there are some that do that. But most of the time, the fungus that grows in the ground, if it's going to work with a plant, what it does is it will wrap around the root threads, the root hairs. The whole job of the root, as we said at the beginning of this chapter an hour ago, we said that the job of the root is to absorb water and minerals from the soil. To be able to absorb water and minerals, the water has to literally pass over the cell wall. It has to pass through the cell wall to get into the root cells. Most of the absorption of water is done by these little things called root hairs. Tiny roots are better at absorbing water than big roots. The more root hairs, the more tiny roots a plant has, the better it is at absorbing water. And we know that plants have to have lots of water. What the fungus does is, remember those hyphae are kind of like little thread-like roots? These thread-like roots of the hyphae will weave in and out of the root hairs on a tiny little growing root on a plant. And so therefore it dramatically increases the amount of surface area that the plant has to absorb water, because the fungus will absorb water for the plant and give it to the plant. The plant does the same thing as the algae does in the lichen. The plant makes food for the fungus and feeds it. You might think that fungus growing around roots are bad for them, would kill them, but actually most plants, 80% of all plants, have associated mycorrhizae. We said just a second ago that the fungus benefits by being fed by the plant. The plant makes food, feeds the fungus. The plant benefits by the fungus absorbing water and giving it to the plant. Plants need lots of water. Here in this picture, it's kind of hard to see. Again, I hope you've got the printout. This is a tiny little growing section of a plant root, and we can see it's got all these little fingers coming off of it. Those little fingers coming off are called root hairs. The fingers coming off are what do the bulk of the absorbing of the water for the plant. If you can see, there's tiny little spider webs that are woven in and out of those root hairs. That is mycorrhizae. That is a fungus that is growing, weaving in and out of the hairs of this plant. And what that does is it will absorb water for the plant, deliver the water to the plant, and the plant helps the fungus by giving it food. This picture over here shows two separate plants. This plant was grown in soil that was treated with a fungicide. This plant was grown in normal soil. This plant had Mycorrhizae associated with it. This one did not. These two plants were grown for the same amount of time. Which one looks better? Obviously, the one on the far right is much larger, much healthier. This one is much smaller and much sicker. And that is because this one had way more access to water because the Mycorrhizae helped it to absorb water. Fungi can reproduce sexually through spores. The mushroom itself is what makes those spores, and the mushroom is called the sporophore, and we talked about this before. The job of the mushroom is to make spores and to release those spores, so in a way it's a lot like a flower. The job of the flower is to make the seeds and release the seeds. The job of the mushroom is to make the spores and release the spores. If I cut the flower off of the plant, I don't kill the plant. If I cut the mushroom, if I pluck the mushroom out of the ground, I don't kill the fungus. The fungus is fine. The fungus is the roots, the hyphae, growing in the ground. The fungus itself, the mushroom itself, is just the reproductive structure. The fungus is what lives in the ground. Here we see a whole bunch of fungi. All these mushrooms growing. This person is apparently very proud of the mushrooms they've collected. I wonder if that's their Tinder profile picture. This right here is a fairy ring, as we talked about. You may have seen one of these in real life if you've ever seen a perfect circle or nearly perfect circle of mushrooms growing. It's referred to as a fairy ring. And remember, it starts by a single spore, starts growing in the center, and it grows like a spider web out from that center point. And the outer edge of the mycelium, the outer edge of the roots, the mycelium, is what actually grows the mushrooms up from the bottom. We can see all these mushrooms growing. This is probably 20 feet across. A fungus grows at about a foot a year. So if you measure from the radius, so if this is 20 foot across and this is 10 feet, this is a 10-year-old fungus growing in the ground. It's been growing in the ground for so long. This shows that mycelium in the ground, and this is how it actually makes the mushroom. It grows the mushroom by pushing up hyphae into this structure that we call a mushroom, the sporophore, and then it makes spores, and then it drops the spores to be spread throughout the rest of the mushroom, to spread the spores throughout the rest of the world.